My tea had gone cold. I stared into the murky amber liquid, the reflection of the ceiling light a distant, wavering star. It had been sitting on the polished mahogany of the end table for at least an hour, a silent testament to the paralysis that had gripped me. In my other hand, I held the cause of it all. It was a wedding invitation, but to call it that felt like a gross understatement. It was a construction of cream-colored cardstock, so thick it felt like a slab of marble, with lettering that spiraled in gold leaf, shimmering under the lamplight. It announced the union of my only daughter, Amelia, to a young man named Julian. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size, heavy with unspoken demands and years of accumulated disappointment. I always thought I knew my son-in-law to be, or at least, the type of man he was. But seeing this invitation, feeling its pretentious heft, I realized I had been wrong about something far more fundamental. I had been wrong about my own daughter. I had raised her, I had loved her, and I had always believed that somewhere beneath the polished veneer she had recently acquired, my Amelia was still there. The girl who loved rainy afternoons in the library, and believed that kindness was a currency more valuable than gold. Now, I wasn't so sure. This invitation felt like a final declaration, a severance. It spoke of a world I had deliberately kept her from, a world of ostentatious displays and hollow status symbols, and she was running towards it with open arms, dragging me by the wallet. My late husband, Richard, and I had always been of one mind on this. We built our life, our entire fortune, on a foundation of quiet diligence and substance over style. We never felt the need to broadcast our success. We knew what we had, and that was enough. The knowledge was our comfort, our security. We feared that if Amelia grew up with the entitlement that so often accompanies inherited wealth, it would stunt her. It would rob her of the satisfaction of her own achievements, the quiet pride of building something for herself. So, we made a choice. We lived comfortably, yes, in this lovely, solid house in a respectable, but not showy neighborhood. We drove sensible cars and took wonderful, but not wildly extravagant, vacations. Amelia wanted for nothing, but she was not showered with everything. We taught her the value of $1 because we knew the sweat and sleepless nights that went into earning each one. When Richard passed away 5 years ago, the full weight of our shared legacy settled onto my shoulders. He left me everything. Not just the savings, the stocks, or this house. He left me the entire enterprise we had built from the ground up, a chain of 27 boutique hotels, dotted across the country, each one a testament to our philosophy of understated luxury and impeccable service. Overnight, I became a very, very wealthy woman, a magnate in my own right. And I told no one. Especially not Amelia. My story was that Richard had left me a comfortable pension and a well-managed portfolio, enough to live out my days without worry. It wasn't a lie, so much as a staggering omission. I saw it as the continuation of our pact, the final, most important lesson for Amelia. I wanted her to make her own way, to find a partner who loved her for who she was, not for the dynasty she might one day inherit. I see now the profound, catastrophic naivety of that decision. In trying to protect her from the poison of unearned wealth, I had inadvertently created a vacuum, which her own resentment and Julian's ambition had rushed in to fill. She didn't see my quiet life as a choice, but as a limitation. My prudence wasn't a philosophy, it was a failing. My refusal to flash cash wasn't dignity, it was stinginess. She and Julian looked at me and saw a little old lady in a paid-off house, clipping coupons and worrying about the heating bill, completely oblivious to the fact that I could buy their entire aspirational world with the stroke of a pen, and not even notice the dip in my accounts. And so I sat, the cold tea a mirror to the cooling of my own heart, the gilded invitation a mockery of the simple, loving future I had once envisioned for my daughter. A future I had paid for, in more ways than one. This piece of paper wasn't an invitation to a celebration, it was the bill for a lifetime of my own foolish idealism, and the price was my daughter's soul. The story of our hotels began not with a grand vision, or a flood of investor capital, but with damp socks and a leaky roof. I was 22, Evelyn Miller, a recent accounting graduate with a head for numbers and a heart for a dreamer named Richard. He had inherited a dilapidated, 20-room guest house in a seaside town from a great-aunt he'd barely known. To everyone else, it was a liability, a money pit smelling of mildew and regret. To Richard, it was the beginning of an empire. I remember our first night there, standing in the lobby with a bucket to catch the drips from the ceiling. He was sketching plans on a damp napkin, his eyes alight with a fire that could have dried the whole place out. He saw not peeling wallpaper, but potential. Not dusty, moth-eaten furniture, but character. I saw the numbers. The terrifying, overwhelming numbers that screamed bankruptcy. But then I looked at him, and I saw a future. So I tied my life to his, my pragmatism to his vision. The first 2 years were brutal. We lived in a small room at the back of the guest house. I did the books, the laundry, the cooking. Richard did the repairs, the marketing, the charming of the few guests we could lure in. We poured every penny we made, and many we borrowed from skeptical relatives, back into the building. I'll never forget the day we finally replaced the roof. It was our 2nd anniversary. We didn't go out for dinner, we sat on that new, UN-leaking roof, sharing a thermos of soup and watching the sunset. Richard held my hand and said, "One day, Evie, we'll have a dozen of these. A place in every city people want to be." I laughed and told him to focus on fixing the plumbing in room 7 first. But he meant it. And I, the cautious accountant, began to believe it too. Amelia was born in the 7th year of our venture. By then, the guest house was a roaring success, known for its charm and our personal touch. We had just acquired our 2nd property, a struggling motor lodge 2 towns over. My life became a balancing act, a baby on one hip, a ledger book on the other. Richard and I made a conscious decision then. We saw other successful people in our town, people who bought flashy cars and sent their children to elite boarding schools. We saw the way their children spoke to service staff, the casual arrogance in their posture. We didn't want that for Amelia. We wanted her to know the dignity of work. We wanted her to be grounded, kind. So, the business grew, but our personal lives remained remarkably stable. We bought this house, the one I am in now, because it had a big yard and was in a good school district, not because it was in the most exclusive zip code. When the company, which we had named the Hearthstone Collection, grew to 10, then 15, then 20 hotels, our lives didn't change much. We flew commercial. We ate at local restaurants. Our greatest luxury was time together. Richard always said, "The wealth is a tool, Evelyn, not a trophy. It's for security, for freedom, not for show." I was the chief financial officer of Hearthstone until the day Richard got sick. I wasn't just a supportive spouse, I was his partner, the co-architect of our success. I negotiated loans, I managed payroll for hundreds of employees, I scouted locations, I pored over profit and loss statements until my eyes burned. Amelia grew up knowing her parents worked hard. She saw us leave early and come home late. But she saw it from the comfortable perch of a life free from any real hardship. She mistook the map for the territory. She saw the simple house, not the sprawling company that paid for it. She saw the 10-year-old sedan, not the fleet of service vehicles we maintained for our business. When Richard's illness came, it was sudden and aggressive. The last few months were a blur of hospital corridors and whispered conversations with doctors. One lucid afternoon, he grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't let the money ruin her, Evie," he rasped. "Promise me. Make her build her own life. Our legacy isn't the number in the bank account. It's the values we lived by," I promised. After he was gone, the grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. I stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Hearthstone, promoting our trusted general manager to CEO. I remained the sole owner, the final authority, but from a distance. And I kept my promise to Richard. I told Amelia that her father had left us well provided for. I used phrases like sound investments and life insurance, all true, just not the whole truth. I thought she would be grateful for the security. I thought she would take the opportunity to forge her own path, proud and independent. I never imagined she would see my understated life not as a principled choice, but as a prison she needed to escape. I never imagined my greatest act of love would be perceived as my greatest act of withholding. And I certainly never imagined it would lead me to this cold room, with this cold tea, holding an invitation that felt like an invoice for my failure. The first time Amelia brought Julian home for dinner, I knew. It wasn't a bolt of lightning, but a slow, creeping chill. He was handsome, I suppose, in that generically polished way of young men who have never had to worry about a rent payment. He had a firm handshake, a bright smile, and eyes that were constantly scanning, assessing, pricing everything they landed on. He complimented my home, calling it charming and full of character, the same words people use to describe a dog that is fundamentally ugly. He asked about my late husband, but his questions weren't about the man himself. They were about what Richard did when I told him we were in the hospitality business. His eyes lit up with a transactional gleam. Oh, fantastic. Any big names I might know? He asked, leaning forward. Amelia, sensing my discomfort, quickly interjected, Dad and Mom ran a few small hotels, Julian. It was their passion project, she said it with a faint, almost imperceptible note of apology in her voice, as if she were embarrassed by the smallness of it all. I simply smiled and said, yes, just a few small places. It kept us busy, the conversation moved on, but I had seen him. I had seen the slight, momentary flicker of disappointment in his eyes before the charming mask was back in place. Over the next few months, the subtle digs continued. They were couched in jokes and expressions of faux concern. Evelyn, you must let me have my guy take a look at your car. We can't have you driving this old thing, it's not safe, he'd say with a laugh, gesturing at my perfectly reliable, 10-year-old sedan. Another time, while looking at the framed photos on my mantel, he remarked, we should get these all digitized and put into a modern, sleek frame for you. This wood is a bit dated, isn't it? Amelia would just smile nervously, patting my arm as if to placate a fussy child. She was so desperate for his approval, so enamored with the world he represented, a world of family compounds in the Hamptons and casual ski trips to Aspen, all of which he described in relentless detail, that she became deaf to his condescension. She saw his criticisms of my life not as insults to me, but as a shared project to improve me, to elevate me to their standards. The engagement was announced 6 months later, via a glossy social media post taken on a yacht I now suspect his parents chartered for the occasion. The phone call came later. Amelia's voice was breathless with excitement. Mom, we are getting married. Isn't it wonderful? Before I could offer my genuine congratulations, Julian was on the line. Evelyn. You have a son-in-law. I hope you're ready for the wedding of the century. The Whitmores, that's my family, don't do things by halves. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The pressure started almost immediately, a slow, methodical campaign. It began with Amelia calling me, her voice tentative. Mom, Julian and I were looking at venues. His parents have offered to help, of course, but we really want the wedding to feel like it's from both of us. We were hoping you could help with the deposit for the venue. Of course, I said. I was her mother. I wanted to contribute. I imagined a lovely local country club, or perhaps a beautifully restored barn. I asked for the details. The venue they had chosen was the Grand Imperial Hotel, the crown jewel of our city's luxury scene. It was famous for 2 things, its breathtaking ballroom and its astronomical prices. It was also, ironically, the flagship property of our fiercest competitor, a soulless corporate chain that Richard had despised. He'd called it a monument to beige. I gently tried to steer them elsewhere. Amelia, darling, it's a beautiful place, but the prices are, well, they are quite something. There are other venues, just as lovely, that aren't so corporate. Her response was sharp, defensive. What's wrong with it, Mom? Is it because it's too expensive? Julian's family is used to a certain standard. I don't want them to think my family is cheap. The word hung in the air between us, ugly and sharp. Cheap. The accusation was clear. My entire life, my philosophy, the very principles Richard and I had built our world upon, were being dismissed as cheapness. It was the first time she had used that word against me, and it felt like a slap. But I still couldn't see the whole picture. I still thought this was just youthful exuberance, the stress of wedding planning. I still thought I could fix it with love, and with money. So, I did what I thought was right. I agreed. I told her I would help. I had no idea that I wasn't contributing to a wedding. I was funding an invasion. The first check I wrote was for $25,000. It was the deposit for the Grand Imperial Hotel ballroom. I remember sitting at the antique desk in my study, the same desk where Richard and I had sketched out our very first business plan. My hand was steady as I signed my name, but my heart felt like a fluttery, panicked bird. This single payment was more than our entire operating budget for the first year of our guest house. The irony was a bitter pill. I was funneling a piece of the Hearthstone legacy directly into the coffers of our biggest rival. It felt like a betrayal of Richard, a desecration of his memory. But when I called Amelia to tell her the check was in the mail, her squeal of delight momentarily convinced me it was worth it. For a few hours, I had my daughter back. The happy, excited girl, not the tense, resentful woman she was becoming. The relief was short-lived. The initial contribution was not seen as a generous gift, but as an opening bid. A few weeks later, another call. This time it was about the dress. Amelia had found the one. It was a designer gown, hand-beaded, with a price tag that rivaled a small car. Julian's mother took me to the boutique, Amelia explained, her voice a careful blend of excitement and manipulation. She said that the bride's dress is traditionally a gift from the bride's mother. She was so surprised when I told her you hadn't offered yet. The implication was clear. I was failing at my duties. I was embarrassing her in front of her new, wealthy family. The old me, the CFO of Hearthstone Hotels, would have laughed. I would have demanded to see an itemized budget, a cost-benefit analysis. But this was not business. This was family. A family I felt slipping through my fingers. So I wrote another check. $15,000. I told myself it was for Amelia's happiness. But as I sealed the envelope, a conversation with my lifelong friend, Margaret, echoed in my mind. I had confessed the situation to her over lunch the week before, carefully omitting the full scale of my wealth, but outlining the escalating demands. Margaret, who had known me since we were girls, who had watched me and Richard build everything from nothing, looked at me over her teacup, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Be careful, Evelyn," she had warned. "You're not giving her a wedding. You're paying a ransom for her affection. And the price will only go up." I had dismissed her concerns as cynicism. Now, her words felt prophetic. The requests became a torrent. The flowers. The photographer, a so-called artist who charged $500 an hour. The 10-tier cake. The string quartet. With each request, Amelia's justifications became thinner, her tone more demanding. Julian's name was always invoked like a magic word that was supposed to open my checkbook. Julian thinks it's essential we have the champagne fountain. Julian's parents are flying in relatives from Europe, and he feels we need the upgraded catering package. Each transaction was a small, painful surgery. I had to call my financial advisor, a discreet man named Mr. Abernathy, who had managed the Hearthstone accounts for 20 years. "Evelyn, another liquidation?" he'd ask, his voice professionally neutral, but laced with an unspoken question. "For a family expense, Arthur," I would reply, trying to keep my voice light. He never pushed, but I knew what he was thinking. He was watching me drain funds from carefully curated, high-yield investment accounts and pour them into a black hole of floral arrangements and ice sculptures. In 3 months, my contributions totaled over $70,000. It was a fraction of my net worth, a rounding error on the grand balance sheet of my life. But it felt like I was bleeding out, drop by precious drop. Each dollar represented a memory, a risk Richard and I took, a long night spent poring over blueprints, a moment of shared triumph. And I was letting my daughter and her feckless fiancé squander it all on a single day of performative opulence. I was paying for them to cosplay as the very people Richard and I had sworn we would never become. And the most painful part was that it wasn't working. The more I gave, the more distant Amelia became. Our conversations were now almost entirely transactional. The warmth was gone, replaced by a strained politeness that would curdle into irritation the moment I hesitated to agree to a new expense. Margaret was right. I wasn't buying her love. I was only funding her departure from my world and my values. I was paying for my own erasure. The true cost of the wedding wasn't measured in dollars, but in 1,000 tiny humiliations, each one chipping away at my dignity. I learned quickly that my role was to be the silent financier, not the mother of the bride. My opinions on the wedding were not sought, and when offered, they were politely ignored. I suggested that perhaps they could use the in-house florist at one of my own hotels, a wonderfully talented woman I had known for years who could have given them the world for a fraction of the cost. Amelia had dismissed the idea with a wave of her hand. "Oh, Mom. Julian's mother has a connection with a much more high-profile designer. It's all arranged." I was not invited to the tasting for the wedding cake, an event I apparently paid for. I found out about it a week later, when Amelia casually mentioned how she and Julian's mother, Beatrice, had such a fun afternoon sampling flavors. When she saw the flicker of hurt on my face, she added quickly, "Oh, it was a last-minute thing." I would have called, but it was all so rushed, the excuse was so flimsy it was transparent, and in its transparency, it was insulting. But the deepest cut came at the engagement party. It was held at the Whitmore's Country Club, a place so hushed and opulent it felt like a museum. Julian's parents, Beatrice and Charles, greeted me with the kind of strained, painful smiles one reserves for a distant, slightly embarrassing relative. Beatrice, a woman who looked like she was sculpted from ice, appraised my simple but elegant silk dress with a glance that made me feel as though I were wearing sackcloth. She took my arm, her touch feather-light and utterly devoid of warmth. "Evelyn, so glad you could make it. We've put you at a lovely table with some of Amelia's older family friends." I was led not to the head table where Amelia and Julian sat with his parents, but to a table in the back, near the kitchens, with a few of my own cousins whom I hadn't seen in years. We were the quaint, middle-class contingent, safely tucked away so as not to spoil the aesthetic. Throughout the evening, I watched my daughter from across the room. She was radiant, laughing, holding court. She caught my eye once or twice, offering a small, apologetic smile before quickly turning back to Julian's circle of impossibly tanned and handsome friends. She was not a hostage, she was a willing participant. She was ashamed of me. The final humiliation of the night was delivered by Beatrice herself. She drifted over to my table near the end of the party, a glass of champagne in her perfectly manicured hand. "Evelyn," she said, her voice dripping with condescending pity, "I just want to say how brave I think you are. Managing all on your own, after your husband's passing. It must be so difficult to keep up. Amelia told us how, Carefully, you have to budget. I stared at her, the words hanging in the air. Carefully budget. The sheer, staggering arrogance of it almost made me laugh. This woman, whose husband's moderate success in import-export was a candle flame next to the sun of my own fortune, was pitying me. I looked at her diamond necklace, the gaudy centerpiece of her ensemble, and knew with certainty that the value of my hotel in Miami alone could buy her entire life, her country club, and the smug expression right off her face, and still have enough left over for a lavish lunch. I wanted to say it. Oh, how I wanted to wipe that patronizing smirk away with a few, well-chosen financial statements. I wanted to lean in and whisper, Beatrice, the catering you're so proud of. My dividend income from last quarter could pay for it for the next 50 years, but I looked over at Amelia, who was now watching us with a look of anxious dread. I saw the silent plea in her eyes, please, Mom. Don't make a scene. Just play along. And in that moment, my love for her, misguided and foolish as it was, won out over my pride. I just smiled a tight, bloodless smile. We managed just fine, thank you, Beatrice. Richard was a very prudent man, her expression softened into one of triumphant pity. She patted my shoulder. Of course, dear, as she walked away, I felt a profound sense of coldness spread through me. The pain was no longer about the money. It was about the utter lack of respect. It was about watching my daughter stand by, complicit in my humiliation, trading her mother's dignity for a place at a table where she didn't even truly belong. I was no longer just a financier. I was the family secret. The embarrassing, poor relation they had to tolerate for the sake of appearances. And I was paying for the privilege. The breaking point, when it came, was not a dramatic explosion but a quiet, chillingly polite conversation. It was a week before the wedding. Amelia and Julian had called and asked to come over, saying they had an important update. I braced myself for another 5-figure request for some last-minute, essential extravagance. They arrived looking like a magazine cover, perfectly coiffed and dressed in expensive casual wear. They sat on the edges of my comfortable sofa, as if they were afraid of sinking into its worn softness. Amelia wrung her hands. Julian, ever the spokesman, cleared his throat and began. Evelyn, he said, adopting a tone of somber sincerity that was more offensive than his usual arrogance. First, we want to thank you again for your incredible generosity. This wedding wouldn't be what it is without you. I just nodded, waiting for the inevitable, but it came right on cue. But, he continued, there's been a slight change of plans. My parents, in their own generosity, have decided to make a rather substantial final contribution. It's allowed us to upgrade a few elements, to really take things to the next level. It's going to be an event people talk about for years. I felt my blood run cold. This wasn't an update, it was a coup. He was telling me that my money, my 70,000 plus, was now secondary. Chump change. That's wonderful for you both, I said, my voice carefully neutral. Then Amelia spoke, her eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet. Because of this, Mom, and because the scale of the event has changed, we had to rethink some of the seating arrangements. Julian jumped back in, ever the smooth operator. What Amelia is trying to say is, to maintain a certain cohesion at the head table with my family's international guests and business partners, we thought it would be best. Well, we've arranged a wonderful table for you, he smiled, as if he were bestowing a great honor upon me. It's right at the front. You'll have a perfect view. We are putting you with your cousins and Margaret. You'll be so much more comfortable with your own people, my own people. The words echoed in the quiet room. I was being uninvited from my own daughter's head table. I, the woman who had funded the very stage they were performing on, was being demoted to the audience. I was being segregated, cordoned off with the other simple folk so as not to taint the grandeur of the main event. I said nothing. I just looked at my daughter. Her face was a mask of strained misery. She wouldn't meet my gaze. She knew what this was. She knew the cruelty of it, and she was letting it happen. The silence stretched. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had measured out my life in this house, a life that suddenly felt like a fiction. I thought that was the end of it. I thought that was the final, deepest wound they could inflict. I was wrong. Julian, emboldened by my silence, saw his opening to deliver the killing blow. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. And on that note, there is just one last, tiny thing. We've been so caught up in the wedding itself, we completely forgot to plan the honeymoon. We want to do a proper tour of Southeast Asia. First class, of course. My parents have handled the wedding, and we were hoping you might want to give us our send-off gift. A contribution to the honeymoon fund. He slid a piece of paper across the coffee table. It was a printout from a luxury travel agency. The total at the bottom was circled in red ink. $50,000. I stared at the number. They had just disowned me, demoted me, and publicly declared me an embarrassment. And now they were asking me to pay for their 3-week luxury vacation. They were kicking me out of the family, but handing me the bill on their way out the door. Something inside me, something that had been slowly cracking for months, finally snapped. The grief, the hurt, the misplaced hope, it all vanished, burned away by a sudden, brilliant flash of cold, white-hot rage. But my face betrayed nothing. Years of negotiating tough contracts and facing down arrogant businessmen had taught me the value of a poker face. I looked from the paper to Julian, then to my daughter, who was now staring at me with a desperate, pleading look in her eyes. I smiled. A calm, serene smile that did not reach my eyes. Of course, I said, my voice unnervingly gentle. A honeymoon. How wonderful. Of course, I will take care of it. The relief on their faces was immediate and sickening. Julian beamed, his smugness returning at full force. Evelyn. You're a lifesaver. We knew we could count on you. Amelia finally looked at me, a tear of gratitude rolling down her cheek. Oh, Mom, thank you. Thank you so much. They didn't stay long after that. They had what they came for. As I showed them to the door, Amelia gave me a quick, awkward hug. It felt like hugging a stranger. I love you, Mom, she whispered. I just patted her back. Have a safe drive, I said. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it, the solid oak cool against my back. The house was silent again. But this was a new silence. It wasn't the silence of loneliness or sorrow. It was the silence of a boardroom after a hostile takeover has been decided. It was the silence of utter, absolute clarity. My daughter was gone. The person who had just left my house was a stranger who wore her face. And I owed that stranger nothing. I walked calmly, not to my checkbook, but to my study. I sat at my desk, the epicenter of my power, and picked up the phone. My first call was not to my bank. It was to Mr. Abernathy, my financial advisor. Arthur, I said, my voice crisp and clear. We need to make some immediate changes. Liquidate nothing further. I want you to issue a stop payment on check number 4587, payable to the Grand Imperial Hotel Catering, and that wire transfer I authorized yesterday for the florist. Cancel it. Immediately, there was a brief pause on the other end. May I ask, he began. You may not, I interrupted, but my tone was not harsh. It was final. Just execute the instructions, please. My next call was to my lawyer. Helen, it's Evelyn Cross. I need to make some urgent and significant revisions to my will. The primary beneficiary is changing. I'm available to come in first thing in the morning. My third call was the most satisfying. I looked up the private number for the general manager of the Grand Imperial Hotel, a man named Marcus Thorne. I knew him professionally from industry conferences. He knew me as Evelyn Cross, the reclusive owner of the Hearthstone collection. He had no idea I was the mother of the bride whose wedding was about to make him a fortune. He answered on the second ring, his voice professionally smooth. Marcus Thorne. Marcus, it's Evelyn Cross. There was a moment of stunned silence, then his voice became instantly deferential. Mrs. Cross. What an honor. To what do I owe the pleasure? I'm calling about a booking you have for this coming Saturday, I said, my voice cold as ice. The Whitmore Harris wedding, yes. A magnificent affair. We are very excited to host it. You were excited to host it, I corrected him. I am the primary financier of that event. I paid the initial $25,000 deposit for the ballroom personally. And I am now officially withdrawing all financial support. The booking, as far as I am concerned, is cancelled. I could almost hear his jaw drop. But, Mrs. Cross, all the arrangements have been made. The contracts are signed. The bride's family can make their own arrangements, I said flatly. You will not receive another dollar from me. My legal team will be in touch with yours to sort out the contractual obligations regarding the deposit. Good evening, Marcus. I hung up before he could sputter another word. I leaned back in my leather chair, a chair that had held me through years of grief and worry, and felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in a very long time, power. Not the quiet, background power of wealth, but the active, kinetic power of decision. I had spent months being a victim, a doormat, a walking ATM. No more. I had built an empire with my husband. I had managed fortunes, stared down bankers, and built a legacy of strength and integrity. It was time I started acting like it. I then did one last thing. I picked up the ridiculously overwrought wedding invitation from my desk, walked to the kitchen, and dropped it into the trash can. I didn't rip it. I didn't crumple it. It didn't deserve that much passion. I simply discarded it, like the piece of meaningless, expensive junk it was. The storm broke the next afternoon. The first call was from Amelia, her voice laced with confusion and a hint of panic. Mom? I just got a call from the caterer. They said your check bounced. I'm so embarrassed. Did you make a mistake with the date? There was no mistake, Amelia, I said calmly. I cancelled the check. There was a beat of silence. What? Why would you do that? The final payment is due today. I'm aware, I replied. Before she could respond, my other line began to beep. It was an unknown number. I clicked over. Hello. It was Julian, and he was screaming. There was no trace of the smooth, charming man from yesterday. This was his true self, raw and furious. What the hell did you do? The Grand Imperial just called. They said the booking is cancelled. They said you cancelled it. You've ruined everything. I held the phone away from my ear, letting him vent his impotent rage. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke, my voice as serene as a frozen lake. I did not ruin everything, Julian. I simply stopped paying for it. I could hear Amelia in the background now, crying. Mom, why are you doing this? What's wrong? What's wrong, I said, my voice hardening, is that you and your fiancé had the audacity to humiliate me, to exclude me from my own daughter's wedding, and then had the gall to ask me for $50,000 for your vacation. It wasn't like that. Amelia wailed. We just thought you'd be more comfortable. Do not insult my intelligence, Amelia, I snapped, the word mom feeling foreign and wrong on my tongue. You stood there and let that vile man and his family treat me like a poor relation you had to hide in the back. You were ashamed of me. Ashamed of the simple life that I and your father chose for ourselves. A life, I might add, that has been funding your entire fantasy. Julian got back on the phone. You bitter old woman. You're just jealous of what we have. I laughed. A real, genuine laugh, sharp and liberating. Jealous. Julian, let me tell you about my careful budget, the few small hotels your fiancé was so embarrassed to mention. That's the Hearthstone collection. All 27 of them. They belong to me. The dividend income from my Miami property alone could fund this wedding of yours every year for the rest of your life without my noticing. The modest pension you and your family pitted me for is a multi-million-dollar corporate entity. So, no, Julian. I am not jealous. I am insulted. And I am done. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, profound. I could picture their faces, the dawning horror and disbelief. I had just dropped a bomb into the middle of their carefully constructed world. You wanted a wedding that didn't include me or my simple, embarrassing life, I said, my voice low and final. Congratulations. You now have one. Send me the bill for my cousin's dinners. That's all you'll be getting from me. I hung up the phone. I then blocked both their numbers. A profound peace settled over me. It wasn't vengeance. It was justice. It was the realignment of the universe to its proper axis. A few minutes later, my phone rang again. It was Margaret. I just got a frantic call from your cousin Susan, she said, her voice alight with a kind of grim satisfaction. She said Amelia's wedding is off. Did you finally do it? I did, I said, a smile spreading across my face. Good for you, she said warmly. I'm on my way over. And I'm bringing the very expensive bottle of scotch we were saving for a special occasion. I think this qualifies. When Margaret arrived, we didn't speak of Amelia or Julian. We spoke of the future. For the first time in 5 years, since Richard's death, I felt it open up before me, vast and full of possibility. The weight of my self-imposed deception, the burden of my daughter's resentment, it was all gone. I was light. I was free. In the weeks that followed, I dismantled my old life with the efficiency of a CEO restructuring a failing division. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage for a play that had mercifully closed. It was full of ghosts, the ghost of a happy marriage, the ghost of a loving daughter, the ghost of the woman I used to be. I put it on the market, and it sold within a day to a young family who I hoped would fill its rooms with a joy that had long since fled. I called a meeting with the board of Hearthstone Hotels. I walked into the conference room, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't take a seat at the side. I walked to the head of the table, to the chair that had been Richard's, and sat down. Good morning, gentlemen, I said. There have been some changes. I will be resuming my duties, effective immediately, not just as owner, but as chairwoman of the board. I spent the next few months immersing myself back in the world I had helped create. I visited every one of our 27 properties, not as a guest, but as the owner. I met with the staff, I reviewed the financials, I walked the halls. The work was invigorating. It was a part of me I had neglected, a muscle I had let atrophy. Feeling it grow strong again was exhilarating. I decided to make my new home in the place Richard and I had always dreamed of retiring to, the penthouse suite of our flagship hotel in the city, the Hearthstone Grand. It was a magnificent apartment spanning the entire top floor, with panoramic views of the skyline. We had designed it together years ago, a private sanctuary in the heart of our empire. Moving in felt like a homecoming. I stood on the terrace, a glass of champagne in my hand, looking out at the glittering city lights, and I felt not a shred of loneliness, only a profound sense of peace. My life was my own again. I used my freedom. I traveled, not to the trendy, see-and-be-seen resorts Julian would have favored, but to quiet, beautiful places that fed my soul. I walked through ancient ruins in Greece. I took a cooking class in a small village in Tuscany. I watched the northern lights from a glass igloo in Finland. And with every new experience, the memory of my daughter's betrayal faded a little more, like a scar that was finally healing. I established the Richard Cross Foundation for Hospitality, an organization dedicated to providing scholarships and seed capital to young, passionate entrepreneurs who wanted to get their start in the business, just as we had. I poured my energy, and a significant portion of my fortune, into helping others build their dreams. It was a legacy Richard would have been proud of, a way of transmuting our success into opportunities for others. About 6 months after the cancelled wedding, a letter arrived, forwarded from my old address. The handwriting on the envelope was Amelia's. For a moment, I hesitated. A part of me, a deeply buried, foolish part, wondered if it was an apology. If she had seen the error of her ways. If she missed her mother. I sat down with a cup of tea, hot this time, and opened it. It was a long, rambling, self-pitying tirade. She wrote of how I had destroyed her life, how Julian had left her because his family could not abide the scandal, and the loss of a financial connection they had clearly been counting on. She wrote of her humiliation, her loneliness, her mounting debts. She accused me of being cruel, unnatural, vindictive. Buried deep in the final paragraph, almost as an afterthought, was the inevitable plea, a request for money to get back on her feet. There was not one word of apology. Not one flicker of remorse or self-awareness. I read the letter once, then a second time, just to be sure. Then I walked over to the new, industrial-grade shredder I had installed in my home office. I fed the letter into the slot and watched as her bitter, hateful words were turned into meaningless, confetti-like strips. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just a quiet finality. The last tie had been severed. My daughter had made her choices. She had chosen greed over love, status over family, cruelty over kindness. She had built her own prison of bitterness, and I no longer had the key, nor the desire to find it. I turned back to the window, to the sprawling city that lay at my feet. My city. My life. My empire. I had earned it. Richard and I had built it. And I would not allow anyone, not even my own flesh and blood, to diminish it, or me, ever again. The past was a closed book. The future was an open invitation, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what came next.